Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a big, modern question by looking way back into history. You see, the region we know as Xinjiang has a long and powerful history of independence movements. And you might ask yourself, why? Well, the answer is kind of wild. And believe it or not, it all kicks off with what was essentially an accidental conquest. I mean, think about it. How does a place that was ruled by a Chinese dynasty for a century and a half end up feeling so completely separate from China? It's a real puzzle, right? And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. And to do that, we're leaning on a really detailed paper from Kobe University. It traces the roots of this whole situation all the way back to the Qing dynasty in the 1700s. And let me tell you, the story uncovers is, well, it's fascinating and it's full of some pretty deep irony. All right, so Section 1, a lingering question. Okay, let's get into it. From vassal to territory. You see, the Qing dynasty conquering this region, it wasn't some grand imperial plan, not at all. It was actually the result of a huge political miscalculation and a pretty dramatic betrayal. So back then, before the Qing showed up, Uyghur society was basically run by two competing Islamic factions. You had the White Mountain Khojas and the Black Mountain Khojas. Now, the White Mountain guys, they'd been locked up by another local power, the Dzungar Khanate. So when they saw the Qing army marching in, they didn't see conquerors. Nope, they saw potential liberators. The Qing's game plan was actually pretty straightforward. Step 1, defeat the Dzungars. Step 2, free the leaders of the White Mountain Khajas, these two brothers. Step 3, set them up as loyal puppet rulers. Simple, right? Well, the whole thing went sideways, and fast. Just 2 years later, the very brothers they freed turned around, assassinated the Qing's ambassador, and declared their own independent state. Talk about a plan backfiring. And this is where it gets really interesting. You can almost feel the personal insult. The Qianlong emperor was so enraged by this betrayal that he completely changed the mission. It went from, let's recruit some allies, to an all-out punitive conquest. And that one moment of betrayal, it basically set the stage for the next 150 years of how the region would be ruled. So that brings us to our next section, a system of segregation. Because this accidental conquest forced the Qing to come up with a totally unique way to govern, they built this two-tiered system. And get this, it wasn't just about controlling Xinjiang. It was a core part of their bigger strategy for how they, a Manchu minority, could rule over all of Han China. This is a really crucial point to grasp. The Qing rulers, they weren't Han Chinese, they were Manchu, and they saw their empire as having two distinct parts. You had the interior, which was Han China proper, and then you had the outlying regions like Mongolia, Tibet, and now Xinjiang. Their whole grand strategy was to use these non-Han allies on the outside to help them control the absolutely massive Han population on the inside. It was a balancing act. And in Xinjiang, this dual nature thinking led to something kind of wild. They set up 3 totally different systems of government, all running at the same time in the same region. For the Uyghur heartland, they used what was called the beg system. The idea was to take the traditional local elites, the begs, and basically turn them into Qing government officials. And you have to admit, it was a pretty clever system. It was all about co-opting the existing power structure. You take the traditional Uyghur leaders and make them part of your bureaucracy, a bureaucracy that was loyal directly to the Manchu emperor in Beijing, not to some vague concept of a Chinese state. See the difference? It's a personal loyalty, not a national one. Now, the absolute cornerstone of this whole policy was segregation. And I mean deliberate, hardcore segregation of Uyghurs from any Han Chinese influence. Han Chinese were flat out prohibited from living in the main Uyghur areas. Trade was super restricted. The Qing even built separate, walled cities just for their own troops and officials. And all of this really hammers home the ultimate goal, right? It was about cultivating the Uyghurs as special allies of the Manchu throne. Think about it. They encouraged high-ranking Uyghurs to learn the Manchu language, not Chinese. They circulated a special currency with Uyghur script. The local leaders paid visits to the Manchu emperor, reinforcing that personal allegiance. The message was clear. You are subjects of the Manchu emperor, and you are totally separate from the Han Chinese. Okay, moving on to our next section, challenges to the system. Because as you might guess, this very carefully constructed system, well, it had some major flaws. In fact, it pretty much contained the seeds of its own destruction. It wasn't long before it led to massive corruption and, you guessed it, open rebellion. So here's what happened. Because the Qing were relying on these local begs to do the ruling for them, they had to give them a ton of power. And power corrupts, right? The begs and their Manchu supervisors got greedy, and they started brutally exploiting the local population. This created this huge gap between the rulers and the ruled, and it made everyday people way more open to calls for a holy war, a jihad, against their oppressors. And those calls definitely came. Remember those Koja clans from before? Well, the ones who were exiled were watching from just across the border in a place called Kokand, and they launched one jihad after another. And putting down these rebellions was insanely expensive for the Qing. We're talking a staggering 10 million silver taels just to suppress one of these rebellions in the 1820s. That's a fortune. Which brings us to the Great Reversal. By the 1860s, the whole system just completely imploded. A massive Muslim revolt erupted across the entire region, and Qing control was absolutely shattered. This collapse forced the Qing court to make a really dramatic choice, a choice that would change the future of Xinjiang forever. So with the Qing gone, you have this huge power vacuum. And into that vacuum steps this ambitious general from Kokand, a guy named Yaku Beg. He just rolls in, crushes all the other local groups, and carves out his own independent kingdom. And this new kingdom starts attracting the attention of the two big players in the neighborhood, Imperial Britain and Russia. They were right in the middle of their great game for control of Central Asia. And this new state was a brand new piece on the board. This situation sparked a massive, high-stakes debate back in the Qing court. One side, led by an official named Li Hongzhang, basically said, let's cut our losses. He argued that Xinjiang was this expensive, far-off territory. The real threat to the dynasty was from the Western powers arriving by sea. His argument was, let's defend the vital organs of the coast, not the limbs of the distant frontier. But then, another powerful official, Zhuo Zongtong, made the exact opposite case. He warned that if they let Xinjiang go, it would start a domino effect. First Xinjiang, then Mongolia would be threatened, and before you know it, the capital city of Beijing itself would be vulnerable. For him, defending the border was absolutely non-negotiable. Well, in the end, Zhuo Zongtong's argument won the day. The Qing poured resources into a military campaign, and they reconquered the entire region. And then, they did a complete 180. In a stunning reversal of a policy that had been in place for over a century, they threw the whole segregation idea out the window. They got rid of the beg system and officially made Xinjiang, which literally means new frontier, a regular province of China, just like any other. And that leads us to our final section, an unsettled legacy. Because this great reversal, it was a classic case of too little, too late. And it directly set the stage for the conflicts we've seen in the 20th and now the 21st centuries. Here's the fundamental problem. You can't just flip a switch on identity. For more than 100 years, the Qing dynasty had done everything in its power to prevent a Chinese identity from forming among the Uyghur people. They had been told over and over, you are subjects of the Manchu emperor, you are not the same as the Han Chinese. And now, all of a sudden, the message was, okay, never mind all that, you're now citizens of the Chinese state. It just didn't compute. And that core contradiction of being intentionally positioned between the Islamic world, the Ummah, and China is what directly fueled the independence movements that came later, like the First East Turkestan Republic in 1933. It created this incredibly complex and unresolved legacy. And it really leaves us with one final big question to think about. What happens when a state spends over a century deliberately separating a group of people? And how does that shape their identity for all the generations that follow?